So much for the talk. It was so interesting, and also thank you for sharing your own personal experience. And it actually meant a lot to me to hear that, because the periods of my life where I experienced a mental illness was also during my final year of university, at a time when it wasn't necessarily being spoken about as much. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I had 3 questions, if that's okay. One was in terms of tightening up the language so that, more kind of severe cases of mental illness are identified and recognised. Do you think there is also a risk when that happens, or, if that movement starts to happen, that people might become afraid again to kind of come forward? And what recommendations would you maybe have to overcome that, if that is your kind of consideration, that this movement should take that direction?
As in, people who really are at the sharp end now feel that they can't talk about it.
Exactly. I think if the language is tightened up, whether people start getting back into that mindset again of, oh, maybe I'm not ill enough to come forward now.
Yeah, I totally understand the issue. And yeah, like I said, I feel reluctant to talk about it now because there's been this kind of backlash, and now no one is being believed. I don't know what the answer is. I hope that people feel encouraged still to come forward, and I hope that other people will believe these confessions. It's very difficult. You cannot know someone's inner experience. You just can't. You cannot look at a celebrity and say, oh, I don't think you have an anxiety disorder because of what I can see. It would be lovely if we could reach the point where we say, if they come forward and say they have this disorder, believe them. And people actually do. But all of that is getting very muddled now because of, everything I talked about.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then my second question was, as I said, my personal experience was at university, so I've followed with interest the kind of issues that institutions also have in terms of managing mental illness now as well, and also how students are supported. And where do you think that debate is going in terms of how much students are being made accountable for their own mental health versus the support universities are now giving?
Well, it's really difficult. There's a debate about to what extent it's the university's responsibility for managing mental health, because it's very different to being at school. And, the university are not your parents. But at the same time, it's the first time when vulnerable young people are not under someone's care anymore. Another issue is that often, as soon as the NHS sees that someone's a student, they sort of push them back to the university and think the university deal with it. It's not really the university's responsibility to deal with severe mental health problems, but that's often what essentially counselling services are doing. I think a good solution would be if the NHS was better funded, but if the NHS was better funded, then students who are in trouble could go there, and there would be less of this debate about there's this massive problem in universities and they're having to pick up the problem.
And sorry, my final question, last one. I found it really interesting, you continuing to bring up that slide where mental health is on a spectrum, and I think that is such a healthy way for people to look at it, and something I felt is sometimes lacking in kind of visibility of discussions in mental health is actually recovery. I think sometimes that's not spoken about when someone does come from a place where they are experiencing a severe mental illness and they do get to a point of recovery. Do you think there's more scope to kind of open up, visibility of the fact that you can get better, and how people do get better as well?
Yeah, I think so. And the sort of popular narrative is I was in crisis and now I'm magically completely fine. I think that's a bit unhelpful. It sets up a bit of an unrealistic understanding about what that recovery process looks like. Some people don't like the idea of even using the term recovery. It's difficult because you want to offer people hope, but I also think it's not realistic necessarily to have these really kind of neat stories about what recovery looks like. I think there should be more information about that as well.
Thank you. I realised I wasn't looking up. Yes, there's a question up in the gallery, so I'll send someone up to you. Whilst they're going up there, I was going to ask, you mentioned showing people the sharp end, like the red end of the spectrum. How do you think that's best? I never thought I'd mention EastEnders in the RI Lecture Theatre, but they do tend to have quite a few storylines where they do show the sharp end of certain illnesses. But then I'm worried that it might conflate with like drama and just for a storyline. So how would be the best way to maybe...
Well, actually, it's a really interesting point. I think soaps have provided a useful service in terms of raising awareness of things like domestic abuse, for example. I think it's a good idea. The trouble is that with a lot of the campaigns at the moment, someone said to me the other day, do you think the information isn't there, or do you think it's more that people just aren't listening? And I think it's a really good point that there is lots of information about what these disorders are like, but the people who really need to hear it are not interested in seeking it out. So actually, yes, something like EastEnders is a very sensible idea. Yeah.
See, EastEnders in the lecture theatre.
Yeah.
We did pass the microphone up to the balcony, so I believe there's a question up there.
Hi. So thank you so much again for the wonderful lecture. I was just wondering, what does awareness mean to you? Just...
Okay. I guess the stuff that I finished on about understanding what the fact that there is a spectrum and what each different part of it looks like. Also, what I was just saying there, a recognition that you can't understand what someone else is experiencing and you cannot judge it from the outside. I wish there was a better awareness about just how much distress and difficulty is possible to hide, so that fewer people would think that you can make a judgment call yourself from an outside perspective. Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you. Were there any other questions up there before my colleague runs back down again? No. Okay, excellent. Did we have more questions down here? Don't be shy. Thank you. Yep, there's one at the back there.
Thanks for the great talk. My question is about language in terms of native language. Do you know anything about differences across different languages, cultures? So, for example, I'm German, and when I came to the UK, I realized that many people say, "Oh, I'm so anxious today," and I don't think we have a word in German. I wouldn't know how to use anxious in German.
Really, that's so interesting.
There is a word, but that would be way too extreme.
Yeah.
Sort of for this, I feel anxious, I have a presentation today. So I was wondering, I feel like in German, as an example, we just don't use these words as easily. So I was wondering whether, there are any cultural language differences you are aware of.
I mean, I don't know in terms of the research, but it's a really fascinating point in that if you don't have the word for something, just as if you do, it can be really helpful. If you don't have the word for something, to what extent are you actually even really feeling that emotion? And it really affects your conceptualization of what it is that you're feeling and experiencing. So if you don't have a word for anxiety, then that's really interesting in terms of understanding how anxiety is experienced in German, because I'm sure the phenomenon exists to some extent, but it's probably, I imagine it's not talked about as much if there's not a word for it. It's a really interesting example of it. It's like an extreme end of this, isn't it? Of kind of not having the word. So I don't know, but it's very interesting.
Just a comment. I think I would probably say something like I'm really nervous, or something like that. But anxious is a very specific one that I realised.
It is, and its sort of common use is relatively recent in this country. It's really overtaken stress, I think, colloquially. Like when I was at school, people would have said they're stressed. Like, I'm so stressed about exams. There's actually someone called Lucy Foulkes at Birmingham who's doing her whole PhD about the word anxiety, how it's changed and how people are using it. And how people are now saying things like, I have anxiety, and how that affects the conceptualization of it. yeah, it's really interesting.
Thank you. And yep, we'll have a microphone on your left-hand side coming.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. I just wanted to ask about the national surveys, and if anything's, you mentioned the point about calibrating the scales and things like that, and obviously it's trend data which is really valuable to people. And is there a, I guess, fear in the academic community that they lose the trend if they change anything? What's actually happening to change how they're doing it and measuring it in a up-to-date way?
As in, like, they would rather keep the word because at least then they can track something. And if they change the word, then they don't even know what they're comparing anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, I guess both situations are not ideal. If the language change really has, if the meaning of the word really has changed, then you can't keep the word and track how many people feel it. But also if you give them a new word, you can't be sure that you're capturing the same thing unless I suppose you try and validate it with, I don't know, physiological measures of anxiety or something. Yeah, so I suspect that's partly why people have kept it. But I also think it's because people haven't really considered the possibility that these words, the meaning of these words changed so much in a relatively short period of time.
Thank you. And a question at the front here.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm wondering, so I work in a key stage 3 environment, right? So 11 to 13-year-olds. And I'm wondering, I really, the spectrum that you showed, I felt like actually that's an excellent visual. Is that something you would recommend kind of showing to that age group and having conversations about that, and that perhaps there are certain areas of mental health, just like with physical health, right, that you might be very in the green for these things, but actually be heading toward orange and these other things, and that red is, as you say, very, do you think that for that age group, that, maybe you don't have expertise in that age group, but would that be a helpful discussion?
I think it's a really good question. I don't know because I've not done it, but I think it would make a great study to show it to them and see what they think and see whether it's helpful. I've certainly had teachers say to me that off the back of my book, reading my book, they've tried having conversations with students exactly as you described to say that, you know, I know you're feeling anxious, but it's a spectrum kind of thing. You might not necessarily have an anxiety disorder. The challenge is how you send that message without dismissing the lower level stuff and without also accidentally dismissing the people up at the red end. So I'd be really interested to find out how we can use this spectrum idea in schools and with young people, but it hasn't been done yet, I don't think.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, and the back row of this section, thank you.
Thank you. I think your talk's been really interesting to hear in as much as it recognises the complexity and it's quite a nuanced position. And I'm interested, have you had any reaction from any of the charities or the people who kind of campaign around this? Because I guess at one level, it makes it quite a lot harder for them. So I'm just interested what kind of reaction you've had to this kind of
Yeah, it's
thinking.
a good question. I haven't heard from any of the charities yet. I sympathise with whoever is coming up with these campaigns. I'm very cautious when I talk about it that I don't want to totally dismiss what they're doing. It's absolutely coming from a good place, and I do think it's helpful for a lot of people. So the emails I've got and the conversations that I've had with people who agree that they're also worried tends to be people who are on the front line dealing with people, particularly dealing with either people in clinics or people in schools or universities. I haven't yet spoken to people who are designing these campaigns, but yeah, I'd be I'd be really interested to hear their perspective and hopefully not come across as entirely dismissive, because I think what we've done so far has been worthwhile. We just need to kind of recalibrate a bit now.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yep, Alana, you've got one just there. Thank you.
I don't know whether this is something, but I'll say loudly enough. So I know we've had conversations about the fact that you may increase awareness, and you may even correctly get someone to identify that they are at the red end. But the reality is that there is not a lot of help available these days. So to what extent do you think there should be a parallel conversation about kind of building blocks of well-being? So not just about recognizing mental health problems, but also recognizing what are kind of things that can give you agency, can help you understand and accept certain difficulties, can help you manage them in a preventative way, rather than we wait until there are problems, someone might recognize it, but actually, by and large, we don't have a lot of services to offer.
Yeah, I agree that another component of this problem, which I don't talk about today, but I talk about in the book, is that we're sending this message that all you need to do is reach out and get help, but actually the help isn't there. And you're potentially making things even worse if you tell people to go and get help and you're pushing them into a system that's already full. So that's another element of this conversation and awareness that's problematic. But yeah, what you're describing, lots of people are trying to do this and trying to figure out how can we, the ideal world that maybe we'll move towards is how can you prevent mental health problems before they begin. It would save an awful lot of cost and distress if you could get in there before they start, by promoting pretty basic things like exercise. So people are trying to do this in schools in particular. So there was going in and teaching everyone about mental health. The difficulty there, I think, is, yes, how you end up making it about the positive side of things without accidentally sending the message that whenever you don't feel positive, that's a problem that you need to correct. I don't think it's been figured out yet.
Thank you. And yeah, a question on the right-hand side of the middle.
Just to reiterate, thanks for a really fascinating talk. You set out really clearly that one of the really tricky things here is it's so difficult to distinguish between sort of measurement and language and actual sort of ground truth prevalence. But to what extent have you seen evidence that people are able to sort of, well, unwittingly talk themselves like along the spectrum? Like, is that a thing that there's evidence of happening?
Sorry, it's a really good point. So one interesting thing about recovery from depression is that you are taught in therapy that sometimes low mood is just a low mood. And you're taught this because if you interpret every low mood as depression, you can actually spiral and cause the very depression that you're worried about. So I wish that that information wasn't just for people recovering from depression, but could also be better out there in the public domain, because otherwise, yes, you talk yourself into a worse state. Sorry.
Thank you. And take all the water you need. That's fine.
Thanks. I think my voice is going.
Oh no, in that case, we'll see if there are any other questions, but if not, then it might be a good place to end.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you everyone so much for attending tonight and asking fantastic questions as per usual. Hopefully we'll see you in the future again, either here or on one of our live streams, and hopefully I'll be here too. And if you'd like to buy Lucy's book, we are selling copies outside. But just to round it off, a special thank you and a round of applause for Dr. Lucy Foulkes.